thing I was going to point out to you guys at the start of class is that you have your bibliography due. Do people remember what the bibliography is?
5 sources that you want to use for your term paper?
Yep, 5 to 10 sources for your term paper. You can use different sources when it comes down to time for you to write your term paper, like if you find they aren't useful, but it's just to get you moving forward on your research. So you're going out and actually getting articles ready, right? So that's so make sure you get that in by Friday. One note, I originally had it labeled wrong on here. In a different class, I used the term lit review because it has descriptions in it. So I changed it. So if you were wondering what the lit review was and not seeing it on the syllabus and not seeing a place to turn in your bibliography, that's because I had it labeled wrong. So it's now fixed. So that's that announcement. Okay, cool. The next thing, well, first of all, any other questions on anything, any pragmatic things from the course? Assignments that are coming out? Yeah.
I have a question about the bibliography. So I'm reading through this thing, and it just kind of says that you just want us to include the article. Does that mean like the name, or do you want like as if it's a citation?
It's just citations. Okay. So I'm just looking, basically it's a list of citations. It's really all of them. This is as simple as we, and keep in mind, go ahead.
You don't have to like summarize the article in a paragraph?
You don't have to. It is useful to do it though. Okay. So like, when it comes to sitting down to write it, like I think it's good practice, but you don't, I won't mark people down if they haven't done that.
So it's just like works cited to Friday?
Yep, it's basically starting with your works cited first. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions?
So I think you talked earlier about how you want us to use peer-reviewed articles or like very reliable sources, which is great. But like for my article, I'm going to have to find a lot of statistics on homeschoolers because that's kind of what it's about. So where would you recommend finding those like within reliable sources?
I think if you actually, there's probably a fair amount of detail on homeschoolers. You can probably find articles on that. Of course, like with all your guys' topics, it might be that when you start looking at the literature, you have to like change what you're doing slightly, and that's perfectly okay, right? But yeah, I think that there's probably a sufficient literature on homeschooling that you can find something in the vein of what you're expecting to do. If not, like maybe look for peer-reviewed articles that are somehow connected, that you could connect to it, and then we can use other sources to sort of supplement that, which we can do as well. So. But the 5 to 10 is going to be, those have to be books and peer-reviewed journals. So. Other questions? Cool. Then we will we'll start our second day on race and ethnicity. And today we're going to talk mostly about something called colorblind racism. And to get us into kind of the worldview of colorblind racism, we have to get into an understanding of race as a continual and perpetual problem, not only in the United States, but in most of the world. So to kind of get us into that, our author kind of assumes that we agree with him on that already, but to illustrate it, I took another author in the same camp as him, who's the person who invented the term colorblind racism, which is Eduardo Benito Silva. And this is from a 2009 article. It's a quote from a 2009 article, "When Whites Love a Black Leader." And so to get us into this, I think maybe I'll just take a volunteer to start reading it. And I'll see if we know the different things that he's indicating. So he moves through this really quick, but it's kind of like a laundry list of racial outcomes, which I think is pretty interesting. You have your hand up if you want to.
Read it?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Or did you had your hand up for something else?
No, I have my hand up to read it. Yeah.
Okay.
Objective indicators show that many of the country's racial outcomes are still mired in a pre-civil rights mindset. The separate and unequal fallout from Hurricane Katrina.
I'm going to pause you in between each of these.
Okay.
Do people know what that's referencing? unequal fallout to Hurricane. Do you remember Hurricane Katrina? I know this is a long time ago for you guys.
I was in it.
What's that?
I was in it.
You were. Do you know what this is referencing?
I'm going to guess that it's referencing how New Orleans took a lot longer to recover than anybody else, and they also have a much higher black population than everybody else. So I'm guessing that they made a connection between that.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, so that is one of the things. One of the things it's referencing is the aftermath of Katrina took a lot longer, even though some areas were equally hard hit to rebuild, and it was partially, in some ways a racialized difference. There's other things that happened in Katrina. Does anybody know anything about when they evacuated people from Katrina? People from white neighborhoods. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. No. I told you to jump in. Go ahead, Scott.
The question is, do I know about the evacuation? Yeah, I watched that, 8-hour Spike Lee documentary on HBO. It was devastating. It's all in on levee breaks. It's very powerful, though. I mean, I remember when this happened, obviously, as an adult. We had a lot of news coverage, but they weren't really showing us that.
No.
So when Kanye West jumps up on the Grammys and said, George Bush hates black people, right, I think that's specifically what it was referencing. How they were left on bridges for just days on end, and bodies were left to putrefy in the sun.
Yeah, and so that's essentially, at the same time as like the white neighborhoods were essentially evacuated, all the black neighborhoods, people were just left on their roofs, left on bridges for days, even weeks, without aid in terms of food, right? And a lot of that was blamed on them looting and being criminals and not being actually, like, you couldn't help them almost.
They weren't even allowed to leave when they tried to cross the bridge.
Yeah, and they were instead redirected to this place that wasn't getting support in the center of the city that was a stadium. So obviously very different racial outcomes, right, depending on who you are. Okay, let's keep on going. What's the next one?
Voter disenfranchisement.
Good.
Voter disenfranchisement.
Way to sound it out. Does anybody know what voter disenfranchisement is? Have you ever heard this term before? So this is something that I think we don't often talk about, which is that there are things in place that basically force African Americans to be underrepresented inside of elections, right? One of these things is prison disenfranchisement, and this is further down on the list, and we also referred to it in our colonialism and incarceration article earlier this semester, right? Where like disproportionately African Americans are imprisoned. The statistics it's going to give here is 7 times more likely to be incarcerated. Well, a lot of states don't let people, regardless of how long it's been, regardless of the type of offense, don't allow people, once they've been incarcerated once, to ever vote again in their lives. So what does that mean in terms of who gets to vote in those states? Predominantly white people. There's also things like common things like gerrymandering, where you redraw the lines of districts and those are often specifically drawn to exclude black people from being counted in votes. There are things like the electoral college and who gets seats on the, because of the electoral college, rural areas that aren't as heavily populated are overrepresented, who generally lives there, right? So there's all these different ways that that African Americans are kept from counting. There's a long history to this in the United States. Does people know when African Americans gained the right to vote in the United States? Yeah. Does anybody have any clue, like, approximately when that was? In the 1860s, right? And immediately afterwards in the 1860s, there are federal representatives that are African Americans. This won't happen again for a very long time, right? And the reason why is essentially immediately after African Americans gained the right to vote, we started unraveling ways of excluding them, right, from the political process, things that still exist today, right? So that's a reference. So okay, let's keep on going. We obviously mentioned the incarceration one, so we can jump past that.
Persistent and growing wealth inequality.
Which we talked about in detail when we were talking about inequality in the United States. What we didn't talk about is those are directly parallel with racial groups, right? So when we talk about growing inequality in the United States, that disparately affects different groups in the United States as well, and African Americans are higher among them. When we talked about deindustrialization, that period in the 80s with the death of the working class, you remember that? That disproportionately affected black neighborhoods and African Americans in the United States. So amongst this, right, we have actually in some ways, and this is measurable, inequality between white people and black people is higher now than it was under segregation. And we're going to get into some other statistics that are even more surprising within that. So keep on going.
Residential segregation patterns and housing discrimination.
Yeah. So here we're getting residential segregation is actually higher today than under legal segregation. There's even studies on things like I read a recent study that linguistically African Americans and whites are becoming more divided in the English they speak, and it's because they're actually more segregated today than they were during segregation. So when we think about, like, we maybe made it legal for African Americans to move from one neighborhood to another, but particularly because of persistent inequality, those things aren't true. There's also various practices that keep African Americans from getting homes in other places, things that aren't technically illegal but are common. Like, realtors will often actually make specific decisions not to show African Americans couples in specific African American couples homes in specific neighborhoods, so that they can continue to serve that neighborhood, because otherwise people probably won't use them as a realtor anymore. Right? So these are they're sort of really subtle, and there's a lot of studies that show that this is actually extremely common practice in the United States. So there's a lot of, like, subtle ways, right, that happens. Okay, keep on going.
Pre-Brown school segregation levels.
Yeah. Does then people know what that reference is? Do they know the rule that allowed African Americans to come into white schools? It's referred to as Brown versus the Board of Education. That was the case that did that. So he's referencing that in terms of school segregation, both the quality of the schools and who goes to which school, that they're actually that we actually have almost identical segregation to what we did in the 50s, right? So we think about that, right? Even though technically we can. And the same thing is, and this is a reference to, and we'll get to what he means by this, where he says the colorblind gutting of Brown versus the Board of Education, right? That we essentially reinforce those boundaries, but we do it in ways that aren't like there's a law against black people going to white schools. Instead, there's ways in which we do that are subtle and quiet, like how we draw school districts, things like that, right? Racialized job discrimination and exclusion from white job networks, the same thing, right? You have informal networks now. So it's no longer that African Americans are barred from certain jobs like they were in the past. But what happens is does anybody know where we mostly get our jobs from? Where we get work from? Most people get work from in the United States. How we find out about work, how we obtain those jobs. Who is it true? What's that?
The internet.
Actually, your rate of getting a job if you do it on the internet, we did, as professors, like that's how we get jobs, but we're kind of an aberrant beast.
I got my job in a parking lot.
What's that?
I got my job in a parking lot. This job. Because of charm.
Because of what?
Because of charm, I think.
Because of charm your way. Actually, that's kind of closer. Did you know the person in the parking lot?
I did?
This is how most people get jobs.
Yeah.
Right? We usually get jobs through people we know, especially if you're thinking about, in business. If anybody here take business, is a business major or takes business classes? They just call this networking. That's just the word for it, right? You get to know people because people can get you things, right? So if you're thinking about, if we're in this sort of segregated world, right, and we're talking about jobs, right, if you get your jobs to the people you know, African Americans don't know the same. Did that shut off? Is that the noise? Okay. African Americans don't know the same people as white people, right? And so what happens is they have less of an access to jobs than the other population, right? So it continues, right? We talked about subprime mortgages already, right? When we were talking about the financial crisis earlier. Once again, those were actually very racially divided, right? Most of the people being granted subprime mortgages were African Americans, which meant in the crisis who lost their homes. When we talked about the rental units, the rent-tied mortgage stuff, you guys remember that? Where the corporations were buying up rental units and using them, and basically like exploiting the population there. Who disproportionately lives in those units? Well, people who had subprime mortgages, and right. So we're talking about African Americans. And then finally, he poetically refers to it at the end of this: nooses sprouting like fertilized kudzu. Does anyone know what kudzu is?
I do.
Anyone thumbs up? You do? Go ahead.
I'm the only person talking.
It's like having a non-traditional in class again.
Kudzu is this terrifying, invasive vine that's pervasive in the South. And I have driven past where it's covered homes and cars, like entire villages have been eaten by kudzu. My wife's terrified of it.
Yeah, it's horrible. When I lived in Tennessee, there's a company that all they did is people could rent the goats to eat the kudzu off their yards. It was like they had thousands of goats and people just regularly did this, like whole hillsides of kudzu, and they just send out. Anyways, the point being is, he's referring to nooses growing like kudzu, and that's actually a reference to, over the last 30 years, we've had a rise in hate crimes in the United States. And so he's referencing that, right? This was 10 years ago, but he's referencing the 20 years prior, right, of rising hate crimes in the United States. So if we take all that together, and this is kind of the point being made, does the US have a problem with race? Objectively speaking. Yeah. That's really so, but, and here's the weird thing, do we have the same problem with race as we did back when we had like overt racism, laws outlawing black people from interacting with white people? Is this the same phenomenon?
I would argue, yeah, it's the same phenomenon. It's just that with like the pushback over the years, like we need, like racist people need to evolve their ways of thinking, and like like redlining is not legal anymore, so we have to do something else, like mortgages or all the other things we were bringing up.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Yeah.
I'd say that citizens in the U.S. found a different way to be racist. So like you're saying, it's much more subtle and it's all legal. I mean, it was legal then too to segregate, but I don't know. It's more hidden. Like it's not as overt. It's like you find a really subtle legal way to do it. You can say, well, we're not racist anymore, but kind of are, So,
Anyone else? I thought I saw a hand pop up over here. Yeah, and that's essentially people who talk about colorblind racism are going to be like, racism has gotten quieter, but in some ways that makes it more insidious. Right? So, and this is actually a big part of this article, right? In some ways people are less racist, but our institutions are as racist as they've ever been. And that's kind of the difference, right? And so there's this divide between institutionalized racism versus the sort of overt racism of individual people expressing racist ideology, right? Okay, so that's kind of the setup for the article. The article's assuming that you agree that both racism is more covert, but it's also a persistent problem, possibly even worse than it was 50 or 60 years ago. So let's go ahead and take a look at the article. So in case you didn't pick up on, I guess I didn't announce which article I'm doing. The article I'm doing today is how else are you supposed to dress up like a black guy, right? So let's go ahead and just start at the beginning. Did anybody pick up on what the incident that he's describing is?
Just that guy was posting a picture or something that facts or afternoon kind of thing. And the phone was like,
Yeah.
He's like a first soccer player, right? He dressed up as a Harlem Globetrotter, probably.
Yeah. And so this is kind of a common story, right? You guys have probably heard similar stories, right? Where somebody dresses up in blackface, right? They paint themselves black, and people get upset about
Didn't the
it.
woman in Congress do that? Right?
I think she did it in the past. I think. I'm trying to remember. There's a few like cases that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you?
Oh, we're just saying Justin Trudeau. He also, there was a scandal with it.
Yeah. How do people usually react to these scandals of blackface? This is something that pops up a lot.
I think there's like two sides to it. Like I know, like a good majority of people are like pretty outraged. But then there's also like people who are like, oh, like it was their past, they were young, like it was just a stupid mistake. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's a very polarizing thing, and a lot of people actually jump up. A lot of people condemn it, and a lot of people jump up to defend it. Right? That it's fine. So this, did anyone catch what this article's looking at? What this article's a study of? Yeah.
So it's looking at the different ways that people defended this, takes the blackface. So like we have 4 different ways that they made it okay.
Yeah, it pulls out a series of themes, right, that are common. Did anyone get what he's reading? What he's doing a systematic study of?
The comments on the news website, right?
Yeah, they're comments on news websites. So he does this analysis of comments on news websites. Okay, did anyone else notice anything about the newspapers? Particularly, where are they from? Some of them are from France and the United States. So it's a comparative study of the comments on news articles, or in particular, news articles on this event, but we're really news articles on blackface. Right? That compares French and U.S. newspapers. There's one other thing about the newspapers. There's 2 different types. So for the American ones, let me see the list here. They are doing the Washington Post and TMZ. Is anyone familiar with these news formats? Yeah.
So the demographic of people who read these 2 things are very different. So the Washington Post is probably going to be your more wealthy, mostly Asian American readers, and then TMZ, not as wealthy. I don't know if they said anything about like the racial demographic of that, but yeah, it sometimes might be considered a little bit more of a trashy news site.
Yeah, that's exactly, so like they're doing one like what we kind of call like a legit news source, and then TMZ is, does anybody know what kind of news they usually do on TMZ? Oop, I heard a couple. Let's take this slide
I
first.
think celebrity news.
Yeah.
Pop culture usually.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tabloid about celebrities, right? So, and it's the exact same division in France. So the Le Monde would be the like legit one, and then the La Presse, I think is how you'd say that. You have better French than I do.
Le Monde.
There we go, wonderful. These are essentially the same divide, right? So one is a very much so a sort of working class newspaper. The other is one that appeals both to a broader audience, but to a more wealthy audience. Okay, so that's our divide, right? So if you want to think about it, it's French versus US, high culture versus low culture. One last detail, did anybody pick up on who comments on newspaper websites?
Was it like older people?
It's not older people, that's not the demographic, at least that's not the demographic he's pointing out. As a general rule, and he cites a lot of studies on this, only white people comment on news websites. so, and this is actually, I think, really telling. So whenever you scroll down, you're watching a YouTube video, you scroll down, keep in mind, every time you do that, all those comments, for the most part, are going to be white people. Same thing with news websites. Those are the people who take the time to argue about things on the comments page of the news, right? So in this way, he's using this as a platform of like, how is it that white people in particular discursively talk about race? They may catch what predominated on the comments page in terms of like being offended by blackface versus being outraged at people even making the accusation that somebody would be racist for wearing blackface. That's probably a poorly worded question. I don't understand what I meant by it.
Mostly defensive. Mostly people being defensive, like about, in different ways, like, oh, he's not a bad person because he did this, because, he just is paying tribute, and some people saying other things like, it's not racist at all.
Yeah. So pretty much across all these newspapers, what the author found is that they, generally speaking, only defend, right? So they're only defending blackface practice. Okay, before we leap into the themes, I'm going to put Professor Cox on the spot as our resident theater expert and ask you to summarize the history of blackface for everyone. Free play.
Oh God. Okay.
That's why I actually moved. This is supposed to be Friday's article. I'm like, I'm going to leap it to the middle because.
Let's talk about it. I can summarize.
A cursory, yeah.
Back in the good old days, when America was great, before the Civil War, the slaves on the plantations didn't have a whole lot of free time. But when they did get a little bit of free time, they often would sing songs and do skits, sketch comedy, just to amuse themselves. And the plantation owners never really minded much. They would say, and you'll forgive the expression, but it's just darky schooling. And while this was going on, a lot of the times what these slaves would do is they would put on like actual whiteface in many cases, that they would do this sketch comedy mixed with songs. The roots of pop music, really. They were making fun of their slave owners, actually. They were often clowning and mocking the plantation owners. And the plantation owners would stroll by and they'd be amused by it. Because white people in America love it when black people play sports and amuse them with music, right? That's what they're permitted to do. So the plantation owners would walk by and they'd be like, wow, I like those songs, and those little comic sketches sure is good. And so the plantation owners decided they could capitalize on it, like we do, like Elvis stole everything from Big Mama Thornton. God, I don't know, he was funny if they started impersonating what the black people were doing. So the white guys would paint their faces with cork board, with cork, like burnt cork, to give it a real black look. And you've probably seen all of these signs, right, from the old South. They'd give themselves big red lips and giant white teeth on their lips, and they would be this grotesque caricature of a black person. And this was called minstrelsy. And this was the most popular form of entertainment in America for roughly 75 years. And it still exists. Like if you go watch Holiday Inn, right, the precursor to the classic family film White Christmas, they're doing blackface in that movie. And then they have a minstrel show in White Christmas, but they remove the blackface. So they're still doing the minstrel songs, and they're doing the whole patter, and even the fake black man voice, but they remove the actual blackface. So it just, the minstrelsy tradition and blackface just kind of got absorbed into our popular entertainment in that way. But the whole ironic thing about it was the white people in the late 19th century who made minstrelsy and blackface popular in vaudeville were making fun of black people, making fun of white people. So really they were making fun of themselves, which is my favorite part of it. I mean, that's like a really long and short reader's digest.
No, that's perfect. Historical context of blackface in 5 minutes. So yeah, so there's something particularly offensive about doing it. And there's also, like, if we're thinking about colorblind racism, there's various ways in which this long tradition of mocking how black people speak actually bleeds into popular ways in which white people interact with one another. You can think about, like, it's not uncommon for white people to take on the voice of African Americans when they're joking around, right? Or this even, like, you think about, like, how many white people do you know who used to speak, maybe this is not, does anyone remember Snoop Dogg? Snoop Dogg had like a language that he would speak in, right? That was particularly like to Snoop Dogg and how he rapped, right? But a lot of white people would talk this way, which is actually really offensive because it's sort of like this mawkish sort of inversion of somebody else's culture. And it was often taken as in joking manner, right? So you can kind of view that as culturally we've gotten used to making African Americans the butt of our jokes, and it's not something we've even gotten rid of. Even though it's latent and we don't mean it the same way, right? It's still interconnected with that tradition. So being farcical about African Americans isn't something of the past, it's something of the present often. Okay, so that's our historical context for it. Okay, so getting back to what he got out of reading these newspapers, out of all of them, and he finds the same themes in all 4. So wealthy white people and poorer white people in both France and the United States have a tendency to use the exact same rhetoric. There's some mild differences, particularly in the word choices, which we'll get to. Not today, tomorrow, or Friday. So like I wanted just to kind of pull out some of these themes that he gets. So the first one starts on page 62. If you haven't caught on to this, in qualitative articles, themes are usually bold-headed. So when I say, what is the theme here? The really easy answer is just to announce the word phase. Okay, so what is our first theme?
Racism reduced to an individual phenomenon.
Yeah. Does anybody catch what this theme entails?
So it's kind of like, in this case, like the soccer player who impersonated a black basketball player. They kind of concentrated on him, and it was like, he's not racist, and this is why. And if he's not racist, then this is not a racist act.
Yeah. Yeah, so it refers to this as, and this is actually like popularly, and this is sort of a divide, right? So whenever you hear somebody in academia talk about racism, they usually mean it as an institution, right? They mean it as a social structure, how we've been using this term, right? Our society is structured in a racist way. In popular discourse, is this how people understand racism in an everyday sense? No, they understand racism as the problem of racist individuals. problem of racism for most in most people's minds is if individuals cease to be racist, we wouldn't have racism, right? So when they're presented with this guy, this French guy dressing up in blackface, their immediate question is, well, is that French guy a racist? Right? And they answer that in a variety of ways. No, his best friend is black, right? No, right? And that's sort of like, that's the trope that we often hear, right? This gets back to, in a lot of ways, a constant theme we've kind of had in this class, which is we're concentrating on, which is that we generally understand most things at the individual level and are very bad at leaping up and thinking about the way in which institutions guide our behavior. Right? Particularly as Americans, we have a tendency to relate everything down to the actions of individuals. Right? He refers to this as the essentialist view of race. That's what our author is referring to this as. The essentialist view of race. And what she means by that is she means that you view it as something internal to the person. A person is a racist. It's an essentialist category. Right? Here's my question. Do you have to be racist to do racist things?
Would doing racist things make you, so it's like, you wouldn't be a racist before school?
Like the action produces the feeling? Let's grab some other thoughts. I saw some other people reacting to it. Yeah.
I don't know how to put it in words exactly, but I feel like at some level we all like contribute to this racist society, whether or not we consider ourselves to be racist.
Well, even beyond like, even whether we consider ourselves to be, like, you may not hold racist views, but that doesn't mean that your actions don't, and this would be the language academics would use, right? Perpetuate existing racism.
Yeah.
Right? So like a good like in summary, like we can think about like globally, right? There's huge divides in the ability of even people of African descent versus people of European descent's ability to survive, globally speaking, right? And which shouldn't be a surprise to us after talking about structural adjustment and talking about global inequality last week, right? Just by going about my life, I perpetuate that system. You know, at some point in the next few days, I'm going to find I need something in the house and I'm going to drive to Walmart and I'm going to buy it. And in doing so, and I don't mean that specifically against Walmart, I mean that specifically like, regardless of where I buy it from, I could also drive down to Leavenworth and get Home Depot, and also at the gas station when I bought gas, it'd be the same thing, right? I contribute to that unequal commodity chain every time I do that. So I perpetuate a racist outcome into the future simply by going around doing completely benign things, right? So the point is like, if we essentialize it, like, I'm sure on some level I am, because people usually are, but I would not specifically identify myself with particularly racist philosophies and worldviews, but, right, my actions can be racist. So this is the difference between having an essentialist view of race, i.e., this person is nice, he likes African Americans, says he has no problem with African Americans in public, you know, and has no history of it, so he's not a racist. That doesn't mean he can't do racist things. In an essentialist view, you only do racist things if you are racist. You are racist. This is a really pretty important distinction on where we place it, right? Because here it has to do with my intention. It has to do with my intention. If I don't, according to the popular view, right, the essentialist view, if I don't have an intention to be racist, it won't be, regardless of the outcome of it. right? Which is very different from if we're looking at it from this institutionalized racist framework where actually most things that perpetuate racism, people have no particular intention of perpetuating racism behind that action at all, right? And thinking about like, even like, when we go out, when people go out and vote in November, right, we're participating and continuing a system which is systematically racist, right? Our intention may even be the dead opposite of that. But in that election, regardless of its outcome, right, African Americans will not be represented in the count, right? So like no matter what, we're interacting with that system. Does it make sense? So his first theme is that, yeah, there's this sort of individualized, essentialist, right? It's decontextualized, it's removed from history, right? The essentialist view is decontextualized, it's removed from history. Rather than having this long history of minstrelsy, right, dancing behind every time I paint myself in charcoal, right? Instead, it's down to that exact moment and what was in that person's head in the moment they put that makeup on. And if we're critics of the action, do we normally, most of the critics that we hear in the news have this essentialist worldview as well? This is sort of a sticky wicket. Do you ever think about like when people dress up in blackface and then people immediately demand that their career ends? Or that they're, right? This is also an essentialist view of race. Right? So the thing is, in some ways, even though this is a study mostly because it's what our author found of people defending it, I do wonder if it hadn't been the opposite set, if this one would still hold. You know, just sort of a way of thinking about it. Okay, other questions or thoughts on our first theme? Okay. Our second theme, you're going to find on page 64. And let's just think in terms of national stereotypes. Who do you think probably has more problems with race, the US or France? And according to our authors, that is a commonly held belief by people in France as well as people in the US. But there's something kind of incorrect about it. Right? So in what way, so like, and this is, did anybody catch this thing? This is the part where it starts talking about, well actually that's further back. But did anybody catch that part where it's talking about the reaction after World War II by French people and how they talk about race after World War II? What happened in World War II? This is referencing, everybody knows this history. What really racist thing happened in World War II? Oh God, thank you. Yeah, so after the Holocaust in general in Europe, how taboo does it become to talk about race? Very taboo. So essentially, much earlier than the United States, in the 1940s, how taboo was it for people to talk about race in the United States? Not very at all. Going back, that's the years of overt racism. You could just say racist things in public and everybody would be like, oh yeah, that's great. You know, in France, because of the experience of the Holocaust, as well as in Germany, as well as in, that wasn't the case. So it became this like, any reference to difference was it immediately sort of like sent out warning bells to people, right? What's the problem with that? Thinking about where we started today's class, talking about colorblind racism, what's an issue with that? What would be a problem with that? Because it sounds really good on the surface, right?
Wait, what was the question exactly?
So like if we're in, if in Europe, nobody can make reference to race politely anymore. Like it's a complete taboo topic to talk about, right? Any any indication that there are different groups within France is just taken as like sacrilege, right? What's a problem with that?
I guess I would say that like when you're too scared to like have the conversation, then you risk not solving the existing problem.
Yeah.
If you don't look at race, you kind of end up ignoring like racism itself.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, because you said that racism would get quieter, which means like more insidious, so that can result in France.
Yeah. Is there racism, institutional racism in France, do you think? If you were just to guess. Yeah. There are immigrant populations who come to France. There's holdovers of the old colonial empire, right? There's people who were brought over there just like they were brought over here, right? There is still racism at an institutional level in France. Yet they haven't been able to talk about it for almost 80 years, right? And even like current policies, like it's illegal to wear Muslim garb in a lot of provinces of France in the government buildings, right? That's a racist policy, right? But if you brought that up as racist, the immediate thing would be, there isn't any racism in France. We're all one people, right? And that's what he's picking up on the French side of it. We'll continue with these themes. So put a bookmark in that. We'll continue on Friday. And then hopefully we'll get some time to start talking about nationalism as well.